Hey guys, welcome back to History with Mrs. Lee. Last video, we spent some time looking at the compromises that were created prior to the Civil War. Today, I want to take a look at some of the conflicts, issues, events, and people who were involved in this time period prior to the Civil War. So we're going to go all the way back to 1831, and we're going to start with Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave, and he organized other slaves to revolt against the slave owners. They ended up killing about 50 white people. Nat was caught, and he and 200 other slaves were killed as retaliation for killing the white people. Now, this is not going to sit well with people in the North, people like abolitionist Sojourner Truth, Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. We'll come back to them in just a second. But it's also going to bother slave owners in the South, because now slave owners are going to be concerned that slaves are going to constantly revolt, so they become even stricter with their slaves. Now we're going to jump forward to 1850 and talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember that fugitive means runaway. The Fugitive Slave Act was one part of the Compromise of 1850 that was authored by Henry Clay. Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser, and he was constantly trying to keep the North and South together. Daniel Webster was a senator from the North, and he kept preaching to everybody that we needed to follow federal supremacy. Everybody needs to follow the federal government's laws. But the exact opposite of him was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and you guys remember him from the nullification crisis. John C. Calhoun is constantly telling the South that they should nullify federal laws or they should secede. So Henry Clay is just constantly trying to keep everybody at peace, and so part of that Compromise of 1850 included the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, Nat Turner's Rebellion, Fugitive Slave Act, and some other things that will happen in America are going to bother abolitionists. And remember, an abolitionist is a person who wants to completely abolish slavery. We've discussed Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave who spoke out against slavery, but she's also tied to the women's rights movement with her speech, Ain't I a Woman? Harriet Beecher Stowe was the author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it becomes a highly successful book. Lots of people in the North read this book, and it inspires them to become abolitionists because she's speaking out about the atrocities and the horrors of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison was also an author. He was the newspaper editor and writer for The Liberator. If you liberate somebody, that means to set them free. And he was also the founder of the Northern Abolitionist group. Frederick Douglass was also an abolitionist, and I think I actually spelled his name wrong there, sorry. He was a former slave, though. He's very similar to William Lloyd Garrison in that he uses his voice to speak out against slavery, but he had experience as a slave, so he could actually go around speaking to tell people his experiences as a slave and why we should abolish slavery. His newspaper, though, was called the North Star, and we talk about how the North Star is going to guide people to the North to freedom, and somebody like Harriet Tubman might use something like the North Star to help her get other slaves to freedom in the North as part of the Underground Railroad. Now, please remember that the Underground Railroad does not involve a train, does not involve a railroad, and it's not underground. Underground simply means that it is done in secret, and it was basically just pathways, trails that slaves would follow to get to freedom in the North. All right, in 7 years after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, we get to 1857 with the court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. This is the fifth and final case that you will be responsible for in 8th grade American history. Now, Dred Scott versus Sanford is considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever made. In this case, Dred Scott was a slave, and he had sued for his freedom because his owner had taken him to the free states of Illinois and Minnesota. Well, he takes this all the way up to the Supreme Court with some help from some lawyers, and the Supreme Court actually rules against Dred Scott. The Supreme Court said that slaves were considered property and they had no rights and would not be able to sue in a court. And the second part of this court case, the Supreme Court says that the Missouri Compromise was illegal and that now slavery was allowed to spread anywhere slave owners wanted to take slaves, so they could go north of that Missouri Compromise line. In 1858, we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is going to be in the race for Senator of Illinois. We have Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, remember, was the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he had decided that popular sovereignty should be used in the territories to let the people in those territories decide if they are going to be free or slave. So he runs against Abraham Lincoln to become Senator of Illinois in 1858. And Lincoln says, hey Douglas, why don't we go around Illinois and let's debate each other and let the people decide who they want to vote for. Most of the topics ended up revolving around slavery, and ultimately, Lincoln lost the election to become the Senator of Illinois, but he decides to publish the speeches, and he passes these speeches out across the North, and he becomes very well known across the North, and people really like his point of view and what he has to say, and it's going to make him very popular so that ultimately in 1860 he will become our president. Now, in 1859, we have the event of Harpers Ferry. John Brown, who we learned about with Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he's back. He's on the East Coast now, and he goes to Virginia. Remember, John Brown is an extreme abolitionist, and he is willing to use violence to stop slavery. John had gotten together with about 20 men, and they were going to go to Harpers Ferry, Virginia, to steal weapons from the federal arsenal, and they were going to steal these weapons and give these weapons to slaves so that they could fight against their owners and gain their freedom. Unfortunately for John, though, there is a train that passes through the town, and as it arrives in the next town, they tell the United States Marines, and they arrive and stop John Brown. So he ultimately was not successful. He is captured, and he is executed in his quest to end slavery. In the next year, we get the election of 1860, and as I mentioned before, Abraham Lincoln will become the President of the United States, even though he won 0 votes in the South. This is going to make several states in the South upset. How in the world were they going to be able to deal with a president that nobody in the South had voted for? Ultimately, the biggest effect of the election of 1860 will be that South Carolina secedes. They say, we are no longer part of America, we are going to make our own country. In 1861, we get the attack on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was an American fort that was in the Charleston Bay, and it's just outside of South Carolina. And so that's technically in the South, and it's part of South Carolina who had just seceded. So the soldiers who are in Fort Sumter that belong to the United States Army, they're not just going to leave. They're like, hey, this is still the United States. You guys say that you left, but you're really still part of America. And so they stay in the fort. Abraham Lincoln decides, you know what, I don't want to mess up anything with the South. I don't want to make them mad, so all I'm going to do is send food and water to the soldiers at Fort Sumter. I'm not going to send guns. I'm not going to send weapons. I'm not going to send ammunition. However, the South still viewed this as a threat, and therefore the South decided to attack Fort Sumter. The battle lasts about a day, and ultimately the South won this battle. This is going to be important because Fort Sumter will basically initiate the rest of the Civil War. It's going to be the first shots of the Civil War, and in the next few weeks after our test, we will learn about some of the major battles and some of the major generals who fought in the Civil War from 1861 to 1865.